Hello and welcome to Who Gets Ahead, the podcast series where we'll talk about what we are doing to increase social economic diversity at senior levels in financial and professional services across the UK and why we need to do it. I'm your host, Michael Barrington-Hibbert. We have a vision for equity of progression where high performance is valued over fit and polish. Over the course of this series, we'll be joined by senior representatives from across financial and professional services who are all involved with the government-commissioned Social Economic Diversity Task Force led by the City of London Corporation. For more information on the task force, please visit www.cityoflondon.gov.uk/Who Gets Ahead, where you can sign up to the newsletter. Today on Who Gets Ahead, we're joined by Rupal Kantaria, partner at Oliver Wyman. A very warm welcome to you, Rupal.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here with you, Michael.
Wonderful. Look, Rupal, you've got an incredible profile. I've had a chance to look through your resume and LinkedIn and spoken to various sources in terms of the work that you've done. But every journey has a beginning. And I'll be really keen to understand what your beginnings were in terms of background, inspirational role models, which helped shape you to become a partner at one of the leading management consultancy firms.
It's probably a bit of a cliche, but my role model is definitely my mother. So I was born in the UK. Similar story, perhaps, to a number of Gujaratis, which is the type of Indian that I am, who came to England via East Africa. So because Kenya, Uganda were colonized, there were a number of Indians who'd gone from India, which was also a British colony, over to East Africa and then came to the UK. And my father came to the UK before 71, which is when there was a dictatorship. Idi Amin kicked out a lot of different individuals. So there was a big influx then, but my dad came a little bit before that with nothing. He was one of 13 brothers and sisters, lived in a one-bedroom place, so really was raised with very little. And I guess did a lot for myself, my siblings, and you see this, our generation, in terms of giving us the things that they never had. So education primarily, and opportunities and a lot of love. But my mother, I think, is a real role model. She started her own business when my sister and I have got a twin sister, were in secondary school and always, I think, just set a really strong bar in terms of what we could achieve, and that I guess the sky was the limit. I think what I see on reflection, having got into the world of financial services and professional services, is while educationally I'm perhaps on par with others, it's all those things around the edges. So we didn't learn any instruments, or particularly other languages, or travel to other countries, or really go to museums or art or opera. And those are the things that I'm really passionate to give my own kids, that sometimes, I guess, help you fit in when you are in the corporate world.
You mentioned your father had, did you say 13 siblings?
Yeah, actually, he's one of 13, so 12 siblings. Yeah.
Okay, that's incredible. And what business, your mum being an entrepreneur, what business did she set up?
She started a nursing home. So she bought a nursing home that was about 25 minutes from our house. And I remember going there after school and eating the sandwiches from the kitchen. And she really wanted to help others. She wanted to serve the community, and she felt and still feels very strongly about the elderly. And actually, my father, who was in the property business, saw that it was a really profitable business and ended up joining her, which again is quite unusual for an Indian family. And they then grew the business together. And then employed sort of over 1,000 people, and then my dad sort of ended up taking it over. But that was absolutely my mother. She insisted on getting her own bank loan. I remember she went along to TSB Bank and got her own loan and wouldn't take any kind of collateral or help from my dad. So certainly, I think that was a great source of inspiration to me.
Our listeners don't have the good fortune of seeing Rupal's face when she described eating the sandwiches after school. because I think she visualized eating lemon
I did.
curd or Marmite or
It was the
cheese or
white
whatever,
bread, actually. Yeah.
whatever it was. So that's fascinating. But so for you at a very young age, your sister and yourself had the opportunities to be around role models who demonstrated resilience, hard work, and that for you was potentially that first exposure that you had around commerciality, your mum going to TSB Bank and really talking about the aspects of business.
That's absolutely right. What I would say is differentiates my family, and again, perhaps many Indian families, is everyone else in my family is an entrepreneur. Nobody else is employed. So this idea of, you said reach the pinnacle of being partner at Oliver Wyman. Actually, I don't think my family would necessarily agree. I think working in financial services and professional services is actually quite unusual for some cultures where it really is about starting your own business. That was perhaps a necessity once because you couldn't get into the professions because of your background, but now is seen really as a ticket to being able to give your children opportunities that perhaps you didn't have. And I feel strongly about socioeconomic diversity, particularly in financial services and professional services, because I love these industries. I see that financial services is such a huge enabler for every other industry, actually. Both sort of at a corporate level, but also at an individual level. And I want to make sure um, that everybody has access to these industries and the industries themselves, that we benefit from the huge talent that's out there that we're currently not accessing.
And what was it like for you? So again, one thing we didn't touch on, were you brought up in London, in the home counties? Where did your parents build their empire?
I was brought up in Greater London, so a little place called Radlett, which is on the overground, and then moved one stop in to a place called Elstree, where the film studios used to be. I always longed to be on a tube stop. I eventually made it to Stanmore. So very much, yeah, suburban lifestyle. Born and raised in London, and I absolutely love the city of London. I think it's a great land of opportunity, of culture, of diversity, and it feels a huge privilege to be able to live and work here.
And what I love about these podcasts, and I grew up in Kingsbury, which is not far from Stanmore.
No,
So again, with these types of discussion, it just brings out a little bit of intersectionality, and I think it's absolutely splendid. So we now understand the foundation of what have set you up on your journey in terms of an inspirational mother, a hardworking father who came to the UK, and I want to stress to our listeners, with nothing.
mm.
The regime of Mr. Amin gave many Indians in Kenya a certain amount of time to get out of the country, and they moved here with nothing. And what they provided you and your sister was a foundation to build on. And I think it's really important because what I love about your involvement of this task force is that your parents on paper didn't have the education and the riches that you had. You've gone to private school, you worked exceptionally hard, you've got a master's degree from Cambridge University. But what I find really inspiration is you want to give back. And tell me why you want to give back. Because again, we can talk about privilege and we look on paper, you have privilege. So why is it, Rupal, that you want to give back and get involved in this incredible initiative?
I think the reason I want to do this is because it's really joyous to be able to do it. I do think that is what a life well lived is constitutes. It's not about just living for yourself. And if one is able to, from a specific position, advocate for others, then I think it's a responsibility. The motto of my school was something like, I should remember it, with great privilege comes great responsibility. Let me say that again. The motto from my school was, with great privilege comes great responsibility, but also the opportunity for joy to give to others. The second reason why I want to be involved in this is, I go back to my parents, is they very much have an ethos of giving back to the community, giving back to your family, thinking of others before you can think of yourself. My father has always said, there are givers and there are takers. What kind of person do you want to be?
There's so much rich content that I can bring out of that. And the last point that you mentioned about your father really resonates with me. So my grandparents came over in the Windrush in the 50s. Unfortunately, my grandfather recently passed away at 92. He lived a great life. And if I can cast your mind back when you and your sister were growing up, my grandparents' house, I had so many uncles and aunties visiting the house, which weren't blood uncles and aunties, but my grandfather came over and they shared a room, and people will then come in and they'll share money, resources, and then one will buy a house and then more will come in. So again, it's fascinating that whilst our journeys are at different ends of the spectrum, there are so many intersectionalities that I've pulled out from this conversation, which absolutely resonate. So thank you very much for sharing. Now, I think our listeners would agree, we've now got a really strong foundation of the values that Rupal has been brought up with. And again, it's really inspirational to hear. Now, what I'm really keen to start moving on to, Rupal, is actually when you start moving into the city. And again, you're super intelligent, but what were some of the challenges that you found being of Asian descent going into the city?
One is all of the additional things that are on your plate that other people don't see, so that when you're going home or if you're getting married, you are also responsible for cooking. The idea that somebody else is going to cook for you or cleaning, it doesn't matter what kind of day you've had. And while the family and the community is a great asset, there's also a great expectation that comes with attending prayers or family functions and all of those additional things. So I think you live this second life, and maybe I'm sure this is true of others as well, but I think that's one challenge, that you can't just think about work. The second thing I think is that being successful in your career is a double-edged sword in an Indian community, because there's also a sense of, you've sold your soul and you're not really a great mother or maybe a particularly good wife. Perhaps the husband's under the thumb, all of those kinds of things. So I think that's a second challenge. And then a third challenge that I'm just particularly mindful of the moment, and perhaps everybody listening will be as well, that I reflect on, is being a woman and the safety of movement. So when you are in the city, you're often traveling on your own at night, late at night, to other cities, through airports, and all the additional um, safety considerations that you need to think about as a woman that I realize that men don't think about. And I do just want to have it's very obviously very topical currently in terms of the violence and that we've seen, the murders of women across the streets of London, to really call out to men and women who are listening, to say, if you're traveling with a colleague, then think about, if they're a woman, if you can travel part of that journey with them, or at least offer to travel part of the journey with them back to Kingsbury or Stanmore, let's share a cab and I'll drop you off first, or let me at least walk you to the tube or whatever. I think that's another added challenge that women face in financial services and professional services. And then we hear all the time about culture and the cultural challenge. I've done a lot of work around women in financial services, and something that comes out time and time again is that culturally it's perhaps not as welcoming as other industries.
I really want to thank you again for sharing, because again, being a black man, I'm privileged. And I'm privileged because I don't necessarily have to look over my shoulder when I'm in the city, getting the Metropolitan line up to Wembley Park and changing to Kingsbury, the Jubilee into Kingsbury. So again, I think that's a really pertinent point to bring up. But also, before we start moving on to social economic diversity, but just in terms of your experience of being a successful executive, but also the responsibilities of home and the community and temple, is that something that you shared and communicated to your white colleagues, for example, for their ability to start understanding and appreciating who the entire person is with Rupal?
Yes, but I think it becomes a lot easier as you become more senior to communicate these things. And I can empathize that when you first start your career, you don't necessarily want to be sharing the additional burdens that you have because you may worry about how that's perceived. Secondly, I think it is becoming much, much more acceptable and almost encouraged. And those people who don't share whatever it is that they are outside of work, there's almost a sense of you know, it's helpful as a leader to share some vulnerability, to share a little bit more about who you are, to be able to connect with your team and to really foster that sense of belonging with your team. But obviously it can be different when you're or difficult when your experience is so different from everybody else around you.
And when did you find that voice, Rupal, to actually start sharing? You've mentioned it's easier as you climb up the corporate ladder. When did you find that voice to actually start sharing who you are and some of your vulnerabilities?
I think I've always shared to an extent. But somebody once said to me that something that really resonated around the fact that they have felt that they've always white centered themselves. I didn't really know what that meant. But as I thought about it, I thought, well, I guess there's a natural sense of wanting to fit in. And perhaps even subconsciously, one doesn't share the additional things because um, you naturally want to be like everybody else. So I'm not answering your question. I guess, I don't know, perhaps recently I maybe still don't really share all of the things that I do and deal with and enjoy outside of work, in work. And I guess I'm still finding my voice.
This podcast, we want it to resonate with senior executives. And this is a great segue to start talking about social economic diversity. Because looking at us, it's very easy to say Rupal is diverse and Michael is very diverse. So the phenomena of social economic diversity is very much one which needs some explaining. Rupal, can you explain what social economic diversity is, please?
So I guess I'm going to try a layman's definition, which is really a range individuals coming from a range of backgrounds in terms of financial background. So the definition is around well, there's a variety of definitions used. That's been one of the challenges, but around the profession of your parents, what your parents did when you were a certain age, whether they had professions or whether they didn't, whether you had access to free school meals or not. So this idea that we come from different classes, the class system is very prevalent in this country and in this city. So having individuals who come from those different range of social backgrounds, but also financial backgrounds and professional backgrounds or non-professional backgrounds.
But I think what's important about this, and I think you've echoed this, and the reason why the task force was set up and championed by the government is that only 10% of the UK population receives an independent school education. But 90% of senior executive roles are populated by that 10%. So what I'm keen for you to touch on now is you've spoken about your journey. You've spoken about the importance of giving back. You are sharing aspects of who you are today, Rupal, and I appreciate that because you're grimacing a little bit while I keep answering the questions, but it really is resonating because this is going to get people at our level across the city actually talking, because again, it's very difficult to look from the outside in to say who comes from a privileged background. So the task force that you sit within, I would like you to walk the viewers and the listeners, around how can employers ensure social economic diversity is championed by all and not just those who come from a non-professional background.
Yeah, that's a great point. So I think the aspect of the task force that I'm involved in, which is chaired by Andy Haldane, is looking at productivity, so to really build the business case for socioeconomic diversity at senior levels. And the first thing that organizations can do is really start collecting data. Even if it's not perfect, it's important to start collecting something. And there's a sense that, oh, we're really focused on race and on gender. And so we'll think about socioeconomic diversity later. And I think that's a real rabbit hole, actually, because while there's, first of all, there's clearly intersectionality around race and gender. But even if, taking that aside, while we are um, going down the pathway of creating a sense of inclusion, a sense of belonging that we know is so imperative to seeing those productivity benefits of diversity, um, there's so much commonality across these different strands, and it really isn't a zero sum game that if you're doing one, then something else is leading. I think we really can move forward on all. So the first thing I'd say to organizations is don't deprioritize socioeconomic diversity because you feel like you've got your hands full on on other aspects of diversity. Really, we need to try and put our arms around all of it in order to get to the real crux of the issue, which is around culture, inclusion, and belonging more broadly.
That for me is really important here. You've mentioned around the intersectionalities of it all. And again, we know you've been extremely vocal in promoting issues that women can face. But what can the task force learn from other diversity and inclusion genders in order to really sort of change the dial, as it were?
There's a few things. So number one, you need passionate leadership. And we need all leaders to really understand the experience of these individuals, which is and of the opportunity, which is why storytelling, I think, can be so powerful across these diversity strands. So I think that's one major lesson is passionate leadership. The second thing I think is really understanding the business benefits rather than seeing this as a compliance exercise. So understanding that the UK globally um, is ranked 21st in the World Economic Forum's Global Social Mobility Index, and we're outperformed by other global centres in the US, Singapore, Japan, etc. And so there's a real opportunity for us here as a country. And then we're seeing a huge skills shortage at the moment. It's a highly topical issue across multiple industries at every level. And there's a risk that high performing talent will migrate to other centres and sectors. So I think really understanding the business case behind socioeconomic diversity, the same as gender and some of the other strands, is something that's important to remember as we drive change in this important area.
And it is, and I really like the fact of you highlighting the current social climate with regards to a shortage of talent, and this really demonstrates that the city and broader the UK need to actually embrace this initiative. Now, you've mentioned earlier that you're part of the work stream led by Andy Haldane, and without preempting the conclusions, what is your view of the business case? Because I think this podcast is going to be listened to throughout the United Kingdom through leaders of industry. What is the business case of having a social economic diverse organization?
I think it's multifaceted, so it's not just about a greater bottom line. There's also creating an environment which reflects your customer base, where you're more in touch with your customers, where you're more in touch with your employees, creating an environment which constitutes a compelling talent value proposition. Increasingly, um, young individuals, young talent leaving university or schools, colleges, whatever walk of life they're coming from, don't want to work in a very unilateral environment. They want to work in a multifaceted environment with different types of people, and I think that's really important. I think we're also seeing that push from regulators. In some countries, it's normal to have a member of your workforce on your board to represent the workforce. So I think there's a whole host of business case examples that we're seeing. We're seeing CEOs and boards under huge pressure in terms of being out of touch with social justice movements. There's talk about cultural wars. So I think from a variety of perspectives, not just the big exciting number, there are compelling reasons why a more diverse workforce socioeconomically is important for financial services and professional services.
We're coming to a close of this podcast, and I've got a couple of more questions that I desperately want to ask Rupal. And given your involvement with the task force over the last 4 or 5 months, what's been your major sort of takeaway, in the sense of, I've met some incredible people, walking into some of the Zoom sessions and seeing some of the leaders on the call who come from a non-professional background is inspirational. What for you have been one or two of the main things that you take away from this initiative in terms of engagement, but also the potential impacts of this piece of work?
So 2 things. Number 1, I've been really impressed with the engagement, with how much organizations are doing, how committed individuals are in terms of giving up their time, the resources of their organizations, who really do see the value of this and who are that passionate leadership that I talked about. The second thing is, I think there's an opportunity with this task force to really aggregate some of the great work that's being done in pockets. So Oliver Wyman did some work around the socio-economic diversity of London, specifically with various different charities. And it was very clear to me that there are grassroots organisations who are doing fabulous work locally. The Social Metrics Commission is doing a great job of being that sort of umbrella to draw things together. But this task force really is the business voice, which has so far been absent to work together with those other organisations to drive change. And we know that we need collaboration across public, private, and third sectors to really drive change.
One last question I just wanted to touch on. I know that you're involved in other initiatives outside of this incredible task force. Are there any other charities or any other initiatives that you would like to share with our active audience?
Wow, what a fantastic opportunity. Thank you. Yes, I'm doing quite a lot of work with the 30% Club and the Women in Climate Finance Task Force. That's something I feel very strongly about. Climate change is something that is affecting every single individual and organization's lives, and making sure that as we reshape our organizations, our societies, and rethink how we're going to rework our business models to meet net zero, there is a real opportunity, but also a risk that a diverse group of individuals are not at the leadership table. And my current focus is women there, but it equally includes socioeconomic diversity. We know those from lower income backgrounds will be more impacted from climate change, and therefore it's even more important for them to be engaged in solution making.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Who Gets Ahead, and a special thank you to Rupal Kantaria for being with us today. Join us next time, where task force members Nick Miller and Robert Bartlett will discuss how organisations are getting involved and making a difference. For more information on the Social Economic Diversity Task Force, please type the City of London Who Gets Ahead into your search bar to find out our webpage and sign up to our newsletter to stay up to date. On social media, please visit City of London Corporation on LinkedIn. On Twitter, it's City of London. And on YouTube, The Global City. Who Gets Ahead is produced by trading and education firm OSTC. A special thank you for your kind support on this series. Find out more at OSTC on Twitter and OSTC Limited on LinkedIn.